All right, case number 2018 CR 925, State of Tennessee versus Joseph Ray Daniels, and 2018 CR 959, State of Tennessee versus Krystal Nicole Daniels. This is for preliminary hearing.
Yes, Your Honor.
Anything to take up before we get started?
No, Your Honor.
All right.
We'll waive formal reading of the affidavit, Judge.
Okay, waive formal reading. Does anyone wish for the rule?
Your Honor, I'm going to ask for it. I don't know if anybody's going to put forth proof with respect to bond or any other issues. Right now, I plan to introduce one witness, but just in the event there's something I don't know about, I'm going to ask for the rule.
Okay. Y'all have any proof?
No, Your Honor.
Witnesses? None? Okay.
Joey Boyd, Special Agent, Criminal Investigator 2, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation.
And Agent Boyd, how long have you been employed by the TBI?
About 6 years.
What is your role in the investigation of this case against the two defendants here today?
I'm the lead case agent for the TBI in this investigation. My unit's the Field Investigation Unit.
Okay. And have you been the lead case agent since the inception of this case?
Yes, I have, since TBI was requested by District Attorney Crouch.
Okay. And could you tell us how you initially became involved in the complexion of this case when you first got involved with it?
Everything began on April 4th, 2018, approximately 6:30 in the morning, when Joseph Daniels called 911 to report that his son, Joe CLYDE, was missing. A lot of law enforcement from the area responded. Initial response was from Dixon County Sheriff's Office. TBI got involved shortly thereafter when the endangered child alert was issued for Joe CLYDE Daniels based on the information that had been provided by Joseph Daniels and Krystal Daniels at that point. I responded on April 4th, as well as a lot of other agents and supervisors, and the investigation continued on from there, primarily as an endangered child alert investigation. The initial report was that Joe CLYDE had ran out of the house and was missing, and that report again had come in around 6 a.m. that morning. We continued to work it with that information as the primary focus of the investigation. However, there were other parts. We were looking at other possibilities simultaneous to that, to the search for Joe CLYDE. Some of those possibilities were that foul play and criminal activity had occurred, resulting in his disappearance.
Okay. Do you recall what day of the week April 4th was?
It was a Wednesday.
So on Wednesday, when you first got involved, again, and not to put words in your mouth, but the initial focus of this case was we had a missing child, I believe, to summarize your testimony, as reported by the parents.
Yes.
Okay. At some point, did your role in the investigation change from that of just simply looking for a missing child to a criminal investigation?
It did. Again, we were doing things simultaneous to the search for Joe CLYDE, just on an abundance of caution to make sure that we are looking at every possibility. One of those possibilities was that his parents had a hand in his disappearance. That changed on April 6th when Joseph Daniels admitted to me that he had killed Joe CLYDE.
What were the circumstances leading up to that admission to you by Joseph Daniels?
Joseph Daniels and Krystal Daniels had been asked by us if they would voluntarily come to at that time it was the Dixon City Police Department in Dixon versus the scene where we were at 1112 Garners Creek Road area, to ask some more questions. We wanted to go over some more information with them. They drove themselves there to the Dixon Police Department building, where we asked if they would, I asked if Joseph would submit to a polygraph examination. He did. Following the polygraph, we reviewed the results of that polygraph with Joseph Daniels. The results of that were failure. We then began what we refer to as a post-polygraph interview of Joseph Daniels. And during the course of that interview is when Joseph Daniels admitted that the original story was a lie, that Joe CLYDE had not just ran out of the house, that he beat Joe CLYDE with his fists multiple times, resulting in his death, took Joe CLYDE, placed him in the trunk of his car, and took him to a remote area where he dumped and disposed of his body and hid it.
Okay. Now, as we are here today, has the child's body been recovered?
No, sir.
Okay. Was this interview and the polygraph process video and or audio recorded?
It was both video and audio.
And how long did that occur?
Probably around 5 or 6 hours.
Now, was Mr. Daniels given Miranda admonitions prior to
He was.
making the statement?
He was, and that was documented by a written form acknowledging his receipt of the Miranda.
Okay. Now, did you have an occasion to obtain another statement from Mr. Daniels at any time? And I'm talking about you personally.
Yes, I did. After the initial admission of his role in Joe CLYDE's death, we ended up trying to go out, and he said that he would take us to where he disposed of the body at. We went out to the area of McElhaney Road and conducted, at that time it was dark, and we were trying to search the area with flashlights based on the information that Joseph had told us at the time, and he was there with us trying to point us in a direction. We did not find Joe CLYDE there. We searched till probably around 2 a.m. that night when the rain started coming in, and we decided to call it until the morning when we could have daylight and the weather would be better. We went back to the command post area in Garners Creek Road area where the residence was. Joseph Daniels slept in the back of a vehicle. While we consulted with District Attorney General Crouch. Around 5 a.m., I asked Joseph if he would come talk to me some more again. The purpose of that interview was to try and get more details as far as the location of where Joe CLYDE his body was disposed at. During that interview was documented by a written statement, no audio, video recordings of that one, and in that interview he again made admissions of his role and how he killed Joe CLYDE. And the story of where the body was disposed of is what proceeded to change at that point. How Joe CLYDE was murdered, that story was consistent with the previous statement. And that interview was conducted on, again, it was working through the night on the 6th. That was about 5 a.m., 6 a.m. on the 7th. At the conclusion of that interview, I placed Joseph Daniels under arrest, transported him to the Dixon County Sheriff's Office jail where we met with the magistrate, swore out warrants, and he was booked in.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach the witness, please?
Yes.
I want to hand you a document, Agent Boyd, and ask if you can identify that.
Yes, sir. This is the written statement that was prepared on April 7th.
And is it the statement that you just testified to about how you came to obtain that?
Yes, sir. It is.
And does it bear a signature of Mr. Daniel?
Yes, sir. It has his initials at the top of the page and his hand signature along with the date and time at the bottom.
And I'm going to ask you to read aloud the sentence that begins with you, I am.
Just a sentence. I am speaking to you voluntarily today, and I remember my Miranda rights from earlier. Everything I told you in the past about how I killed my son, baby Joe CLYDE Daniels III, is true. Also, that night, I got into my car and drove down McElhaney Road, and I got baby Joe out of the trunk. I had my wife's cell phone in my left hand, using it as a flashlight, and baby Joe was over my right shoulder.
Can I stop you right there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Have you seen, in the course of the investigation, anything that would lead you to believe that he did, in fact, have his wife's cell phone?
Yes, sir.
And could you tell us just briefly what that is?
Yes, sir. We, part of the criminal investigation, obtained cell phone location records of his wife, Krystal Daniels' cell phone. Those location records show the phone moving away and outside of area of the residence the night of April and morning of April 4th.
Good. And then if you would continue reading, please.
I know it was my wife's cell phone because it doesn't have a passcode, and mine was still plugged in at the house charging. Earlier that night, I got woken up by Alex, who told me that baby Joe had peed on the floor. I went in and told them to get their, forgive my language, to get their asses in the bed. Baby Joe started laughing, so I beat him. That's when he ran out the front door. Baby Joe ran to the road. I saw a car drive by, and then I ran out and got him back in the house.
And I want to stop you at that point now, Agent Boyd. In the course of your investigation, have you been able to determine whether there was any other person that saw Joe CLYDE Daniels outside the night of April 4th or the early morning hours of April the 4th?
Yes, sir. There was.
Could you tell us about that?
Yes, sir. Individual, I believe his first name was Daniel, last name McCormick, was on his way home from work. He had stopped at the Love's gas station to purchase some items on his way home. He was driving down Garners Creek Road, and he saw a child, and the description that he provided was Joe CLYDE Daniels. It was the exact description of his pajamas that he was wearing that night.
Okay. Would it be fair to say then that the part of the statement that Mr. Daniels gave you about the child running out of the house has been corroborated by an independent witness?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And if you would, please begin reading the sentence. I think we got down as far as the sentence that begins with, the sentence that ends with back in the house, and the next sentence would begins with I.
Yes, sir. I beat him some more. That's when I killed baby Joe. I beat him with a closed fist and put his body in the trunk of my car, the red Chevrolet Impala. I went back in to grab a cell phone and got my wife's phone. I took that phone with me when I took baby Joe out to dump his body. I lied to you previously about where I placed baby Joe's body. Earlier I told you it was in a field, and I showed you on the map where the field was along McElhaney Road, where it turns into a dirt road. I am now telling you the truth about that part. I placed baby Joe's body in the pond right there on the right side of the dirt road, where the road curves right there in the area I showed you on the map. I placed baby Joe wearing his pajamas in the pond right there.
Is the parts of the statement that you just read consistent with the initial interview he gave you with respect to the killing of the child?
Yes, sir.
And the only part of the statement that you just read where he says that he lied is the part about where he placed the body. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Agent Boyd, are you aware of whether or not Mr. Daniels made any more admissions or statements or confessions to anyone else in law enforcement?
Yes, sir, he did. In addition to statements, just spontaneous utterances of, I'm sorry for what I've done, Sheriff Jeff Bledsoe was speaking with Joseph Daniels as well. I believe that interview is recorded audio, and in that interview there are admissions as well.
Okay. Have you had an opportunity to review that?
I have.
Based upon your review, are the admissions of the killing of this child consistent with the initial interview you did and his handwritten statement?
Yes.
I'm going to go back to this handwritten statement. Was the area that he told you where the body was disposed of searched?
Yes. That written statement, like I mentioned earlier, was around 5, 6 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, April 7th. As soon as daylight came, I believe it was around 7, 8 a.m., additional personnel were brought to the scene. We brought in, TBI alone brought in dozens, 8 of agents from different units. as well as Dixon County Sheriff's Office deputies. We had, it was all law enforcement at that point, to search the area of McElhaney Road. We also brought in TWRA, committed a lot of personnel as far as searching ponds and water areas. There were, in addition to law enforcement, there were also fire and rescue divers searching not only the pond that he mentioned, but also every pond that we knew of in the area. The search focused on that initial field and that initial pond. However, it extended, I mean, throughout that area and on. Ponds, waterways, fields, woods, and you know, since then, 2-3 times a week, those searches have commenced.
Can you give us an estimate, Agent Boyd, of how many different locations Mr. Daniels said he placed this child's body?
There were at least 2 there, the field and the pond. That Saturday also, while those searches were being conducted and towards the end, myself and another agent went to the jail and asked Joseph Daniels if he would ride with us and show us exactly where. At that point, he started changing his story now, just saying that it was a river in Hickman County. They threw his body off the bridge. We proceeded to drive down 48, go into multiple places, multiple bridges. We got to one specific bridge that I believe it was over the Piney River. I mean, to include on that trip, there were probably 3 or 4 places that he thought he may have done it at, but he ended up changing his story afterwards and saying, no, it wasn't here. And then he went back to the pond and the field area. So to answer your question, approximately 6 or 7 different places.
And was every place that he told you he dumped the body searched?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Were additional areas searched
Yes,
based
sir.
on other information?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In your interview with him, did he have anything to say at all about who came up with the story that Baby Joe had walked out of the house?
He said that he made up the story. No references were made at that time to Krystal Daniels.
Could you repeat that?
Well, forgive me. He did say, I said no references were made regarding Krystal Daniels, except for the fact that he did say that Krystal and Alex were present when Joe CLYDE was killed. He said that they witnessed it.
No, I think perhaps you didn't understand my question.
No, sir.
I'm sorry. Let me back up completely. Was there a story told to you initially by Joseph Daniels and Krystal Daniels about how this child got out of the house?
Oh, yes, sir. There was.
And briefly, could you summarize what that story was?
Sure. The initial story was that they were woken up by Alex, saying that Joe CLYDE had urinated on the floor. Joseph told Krystal that he would handle it. He got out.
And what time, if he said?
I believe that was around 11:30, 12, that they stated at that time that they were woken up. Joseph told Krystal that he would handle it. He went in there, and the initial story was that he calmly and rationally and quietly just told them to get back in bed, and that he cleaned up the pee on the floor, and then he went back to sleep. Story that he said was that Krystal woke up at around 1 a.m., checked on the kids, tucked Joe CLYDE into bed where he was sleeping. When she went back to sleep, at 5:30 a.m. he woke up to get them ready for school and get their clothes ready for the day. So when he noticed Joe CLYDE was not in the bed, he said he went to the door. He noticed also that the coffee table was not in the same place that it was, and that the door, there was a padlock on the door that had been removed and was not there.
Now, was that story or those facts you just relayed to the court told to you by both Joseph Daniels and Krystal Daniels?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, my original question, and I think I got tongue-tied, was that in your interview with him, did he tell you how that story came to be? Who was the, for want of a better word, the author of that story?
He was the author of that story.
Including the 1 a.m. check by Krystal?
He didn't make any references to that 1 a.m. check, just that that's not what happened.
Okay. But nonetheless, is that the same story, or that same story, was it what was being told to you by both Joseph and Krystal?
Yes, sir.
And from the get-go?
Yes, sir. Myself, other agents, Dixon County Sheriff's deputies, family members, friends on Facebook, that was up until Joseph confessed, that's what Joseph was saying.
And so he made his initial confession, the written confession. You know, because you've witnessed parts of it, that he made a confession to Sheriff Bledsoe, and then there were several other spontaneous admissions and outbursts.
Yes, and it's, when myself and another agent were driving him down 48 to Hickman County after he'd been arrested, that's also, he was telling us, making admissions then as well.
And have the admissions that he made with respect to the killing of this child all been consistent?
They have.
And would it be fair to say, Agent Boyd, that the only thing that's been inconsistent is where he placed the child?
Yes, sir.
During any of those statements, did you hear him say why that is, why he's not telling law enforcement where this child is?
In the statement to Sheriff Jeff Bledsoe, he made statements that he wanted to tell us where the body was, but he couldn't. He stated that he doesn't want people to see what he's done to Joe CLYDE.
Okay. Now, the person that we've been talking about that gave you these statements and in fact signed the one that's Exhibit 1, is he in the courtroom today?
Yes, sir, he is.
Could you point to him, please? Your Honor, if the record reflect, he has identified the defendant, Joseph Daniels. Agent Boyd, in which county did all of these events occur?
Dixon County.
Okay. Now, at some point, and I'm going to shift my focus now to Krystal Daniels. At some point during your involvement, did you interview her?
Yes, sir, I did.
And when was that?
I interviewed Krystal Daniels on Monday, April 9th.
And what were the circumstances of that interview? How did it come to be that you were interviewing her?
Very similar to Joseph Daniels. Had asked Krystal Daniels if she would take a polygraph examination, again at the Dixon City Police Department. She agreed to do that. That polygraph examination was conducted. Same result as Joseph Daniels. That resulted in failure, which then led to a post-polygraph interview. And in the course of that post-polygraph interview is when Krystal Daniels admitted to her involvement in the murder of Joe CLYDE.
Okay. Now, at any time prior to either the polygraph or the actual interview itself, was she given her Miranda admonition?
She was.
Okay. And is her, as far as you know, is her entire polygraph, pre-polygraph, polygraph, and then subsequent interview recorded?
It is, audio and video.
Okay. And what did she ultimately specifically tell you that happened that night?
Specifically, Krystal Daniels stated that she was asleep in bed with Joseph when Alex came and woke them up, stating that Joe CLYDE had urinated on the floor. Joseph said that he'd handle it. He got up. She said that she heard a loud scream. She described it as not a scream or a cry, but in between a painful scream. And then she described it that it suddenly just stopped, and it was silence. She came out of her room, saw Joe CLYDE on the ground, motionless, not moving, and Joseph standing over him with his fists clenched. And I asked her if she could see his face, if he was moving or breathing. She said she never got close enough. She stated she never got close enough to check on him, not even to see his face. She went back to her room, She heard the car door shut. She came out of the room, saw that Joseph and Joe CLYDE were gone. She looked out the window and saw that the red Impala was gone. She said she went back to her room and went to sleep.
She went back to her room and went to sleep?
Yes, sir.
Did she make any reference at all as to her cell phone, if she had it, if she didn't have it?
She did. She said that her cell phone was gone, she said it was in the bedroom originally, and that it was not there when she went back, when Joseph was gone.
Did she make any statements at all with regard to the story that when I say you, that law enforcement had been being told all week about the child?
She did. She stated that she lied and made up the story about the 1 a.m. check on Joe CLYDE, that never happened.
What, if anything, did she say that her involvement in the creation of the story was?
Krystal Daniels stated that she created the story. She said she made it up, the 1 a.m. check, and that is the same story that independently she told law enforcement, and Joseph Daniels as well told law enforcement.
Based on the conclusion of your interview and the other evidence, Agent Boyd, did you charge Ms. Daniels with something?
I did.
And what was the charge that you levied against her?
The statute of the charge against Krystal Daniels was Haley's Law, aggravated child neglect, abuse, or endangerment.
The car that she described, the red car, is that consistent with the car that Joseph Daniels said he used?
Yes, sir.
And I believe, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but you did testify that she said she could not find her cell phone after this event. And Mr. Daniels, in at least one of his interviews, said that he had her cell phone. Is that what you testified to?
Yes.
Okay. Can you summarize for us, Agent Boyd, and I know it's voluminous, but other physical evidence that has been collected and is being processed, even as we speak?
The red Impala has been collected, a search warrant executed on it. It's been processed at our lab in Nashville, the TBI lab, by forensic scientists. Presumptive tests did indicate the presence of blood on the center console of the red Impala. Those tests are still in process as far as DNA comparisons go. However, the testing during the examination of the vehicle did indicate blood.
Okay. And can you just summarize for us again any other evidence that was collected, and it's any other evidence that was collected, and leave it at that?
Yes. The night of Joseph Daniels' arrest, collected his clothing that he was wearing. He described to me during his audio-video recorded interview the clothing that he was wearing when he killed Joe CLYDE. And he described that to be a black shirt with an alien dressed as Santa Claus on it with the words "believe." He also mentioned that he was wearing gym shorts. He was wearing those gym shorts the night of his interview and the night of his arrest. He also stated that he was wearing shoes, the same shoes he was wearing upon his arrest. The black shirt, he stated, had been washed already, and it was at the house. We collected that from the house. The clothing that he was wearing at the time of his arrest was collected as well. He was wearing a hoodie. He had a T-shirt on that said, it was a blue shirt that said Super Dad on it. That was collected. He was wearing the gym shorts underneath his pants. Those were collected as well. The pants were collected and his shoes were collected. All those clothing items were examined. Presumptive tests did indicate blood on the hoodie, on the pants, and on both shoes.
And you said presumptive. Has any further DNA testing been completed?
It is not.
Is it in process?
It is in process.
Were both Mr. Daniels and Ms. Daniels' cell phones collected?
They were.
And have they been analyzed?
They have.
are there just, in summary, any other items of physical evidence, and by that I mean clothing, phones, anything else that was collected? For example, anything from within the house, the yard?
There are numerous items that have been collected. Some of those, the house was searched with a search warrant. Pieces of the flooring were collected. Multiple items were taken from the house. We have also conducted search warrants on the cell phone providers and records. We've conducted search warrants with Google with Facebook, and we've collected a lot of information from Facebook accounts. We've received information from Google, and we're continuing to work with Google and getting more information, some of that including location information from Google.
Have you been able to determine the residence where this occurred? Who actually owns that?
The residence is owned by Joseph's father, Joe, and Joseph's stepmother, Belle.
Have you been able to determine whether or not at the time of this crime, or at least that it was reported, whether or not either of the defendants were employed?
They were not. Neither of the defendants, Joseph or Krystal, were employed at the time of the crime.
Okay. Your Honor, I think at this point I don't have any further questions for Agent Boyd.
What were some of the items that were taken from the house?
Some of the items were butcher block, knives, I believe fragments of carpet. I'd have to review. Our crime scene team, consisting of forensic scientists, were the ones that actually conducted that search and the examination of it. So I would have to consult the reports from them as far as exactly all the items that were collected from the house.
Any test result indicate the presence of blood in the house?
Joseph and Krystal Daniels, Joseph Daniels, in his interview with me, admitted that he saw no blood. Our crime scene team did test and search for existence of blood in the house, and those tests came back negative. They did not find any blood in the house.
And Joseph Daniels indicated that he beat Joe Clyde for some 5 to 10 minutes in the living room. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was one of his statements.
In proximity, close proximity to a coffee table.
Yes, sir.
All right, and in another statement, did he tell you he beat Joe Clyde somewhere else?
No, sir, he didn't.
He said that he struck him in the head, in the back, and also in the face. Is that correct?
He stated the body, the torso, the head, and a couple times in the face.
And would it surprise you not to find some blood in that area?
It would not surprise me, given the age of Joe Clyde, his stature, the density of his bone makeup, just the developing characteristics of his physiology. It would not surprise me to not find blood.
So if he struck in the face, you don't think he would bleed?
It depends where in the face.
Was any of the older brother's clothing taken for DNA testing?
I'm not certain of that. I'd have to check our records.
And were you advised that the older brother had actually beaten Joe Clyde and put him in the hospital previously?
I'm not familiar with that. Again, there's a lot of reports I'd have to go back and review if there's a certain one you're referring to.
But in your statements you were taken from Joseph Daniels, you certainly considered the older brother and the mother as someone who might have done this to Joe Clyde.
I never considered the older brother. He's an 8-year-old. To inflict such damage to result in the death of a 5-year-old, I would be surprised at that. Krystal Daniels, yes, sir, definitely considered her and her role in it as well with Joseph Daniels.
But in fact, you asked my client, Joseph Daniels, if the older brother had in fact done something to the child.
I don't recall doing that.
You don't recall that?
No, sir.
If that's on the video?
I'd have to review the video, sir.
Okay.
It's 3-4 hours long.
Well, if you ask if Krystal or the brother had done something, that would be because that was a possibility at that time you wanted to know about.
I remember asking if Krystal or Alex, what did they see? I specifically remember asking about that. I don't recall asking about what Alex had done or if he had done anything.
And Joseph Daniels didn't confess to his doing something to Joe Clyde until after you had asked about Krystal and whether she did something.
Again, Joseph, I believe my questions were relating to what did Krystal see, as well as what did Alex see.
What size child is Alex?
Alex is an 8-year-old boy.
Does he weigh over 125 pounds?
I haven't weighed him, sir. I'm not familiar with that information.
So you're not familiar with him beating Joe Clyde previously and Joe Clyde having to be taken to the hospital?
No, sir, I'm not.
If that had happened, would that make you, if you had known that, wouldn't you want to look a little more in depth into what he may have done?
No, sir. Based on the information that we had, the facts of the investigation at that point, everything's being corroborated that Joseph is the one that inflicted the damage on Joe Clyde.
All right. What corroborates that Joseph did it as opposed to Krystal or Alex?
The blood on his clothing.
But you don't know whose blood that is.
Not yet. Those tests are in process.
Did you know that Joseph Daniels had just had blood drawn the day before to check the levels of his mental health medications?
I'd have to see those records, sir.
I'm just asking, are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
Did he have a place on his arm where you could see blood was drawn?
I looked on his arms looking for injuries as well as his legs, especially given the area that he said he disposed of the body, looking for cuts because the areas were, there were lots of thorns and high grass that would have resulted in cuts from those areas, and I did not observe any injuries to his arms or his legs.
Who else gave statements to law enforcement that you're aware of?
You'd have to be more specific, sir. There are,
Okay.
up
All right,
to this
in the
point, there are
house,
about 200.
in the household, did you take, or someone take statements from little Joe's Aunt Joyce?
Yes, sir.
And did she indicate that the night before that Joseph Daniels and Krystal had been arguing, and Krystal was talking about hauling little Joe off?
I remember her interview. I did not conduct that interview, but I've reviewed it. Aunt Joyce's statements that I recall were that they had the argument the night before, and that the arguments were relating to Krystal's infidelity and their relationship.
And did she tell you that Krystal had talked about taking little Joe off?
I'd have to review that interview. She did not tell me that, but you know, I've seen other information where their marriage was on the rocks and that she was talking about taking the other kids.
Were those statements recorded?
Which statements, sir?
From
Aunt
Aunt Joyce?
I believe it was a written interview.
Okay.
So no, sir. Not
That being where you write down what she says?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Either a written interview or an oral interview.
If she had told you that Krystal had been threatening to haul little Joe off somewhere, you would have written that down, wouldn't you?
Again, I'd have to review. I was not the agent there. However, we write down any pertinent, you know, what she says in her own words. She reviews it. We read it back to her. She has an opportunity to see it and to make any changes to it.
All right. Is there any physical evidence to indicate that it was Joseph Daniels who took Joe Clyde Daniels away from that house as opposed to Krystal?
Yes, sir. His statement that he took her cell phone, as well as Krystal stating that she saw him, she was aware that the car door shut, the red Impala drove off, and Joseph and Joe Clyde were not present at the house. The blood that's on his clothing, as well as the blood that's from the center console, all leads to the veracity of that statement.
How does that blood in any way corroborate anything if it's not little Joe's?
It's in process. We don't know whose it is at this point.
Exactly. So how does it corroborate anything?
As opposed to the absence of blood.
But Joseph Daniels didn't have any scratches or scrapes that would indicate he had walked through briars or brush or anything like that.
None that I observed.
He didn't have any marks or bruises on his hands or anything that would indicate he had struck anybody.
Not that I observed.
So as far as the telephone, he told you who took the telephone.
Yes, sir.
If he's lying to protect Krystal, it could have been Krystal that left with the telephone.
She stated as well that her phone was not there. He stated.
I understand.
He stated in great detail the fact that he knows it was her phone because he used it as a flashlight. Hers does not have a passcode. His was plugged in charging.
Right. If she's told him what to say to protect her, then we still don't know if it was her that left with the phone or Joseph Daniels.
We have no information to show that she was outside of the home. We do have a witness, Miss Jenny Jones, who was driving down Garners Creek Road and witnessed Joseph Daniels outside on that road in the early morning hours of April 4th, 2018. She stated that he was standing there. When she drove by with her headlights, he froze or appeared to freeze and would not look up at her. He faced the woods.
Where was that located?
It was a couple miles south of the residence at 1112 Garners Creek Road, a couple miles south, I believe, right where there are some guardrails on Garners Creek Road.
And about what time?
I'd have to review the exact details of the time. I don't recall. I just remember it was early morning hours before the sun came up.
It's after they said that little Joe was missing.
No, sir. It's before 5:30 a.m.
Before 5:30 a.m.?
Yes, sir.
All right. Were you aware of what mental health disabilities Mr. Joseph Daniels had when you questioned him?
He made some references that he has anxiety issues, that he you know, may take some medications, but again, I don't recall exactly what those were. During his interviews to me, he was extremely lucid, knew everything that was going on. Every time I've dealt with him, he's been extremely calm, and never shown any anger towards me or anyone else that I've observed. However, you know, I've heard stories too that he has rage issues, but I have not witnessed any. And as far as having any observable psychological issues, I have not.
I didn't ask you about rage issues.
You
I
asked-
asked you, are you aware that he had any mental health issues?
I was explaining
At the
to you
time.
my awareness of any medical issues he may have, as well as the absence of any medical issues I may have observed.
At the time you interviewed him? Did you ask him what medications he was on?
If I did not, the polygraph examiner may have. I'm sure that's probably pretty standard in polygraph examination.
Did you know he was on lithium, Risperdal, and other medications to treat mental health issues?
At some point I remember hearing about lithium, but I'm not exactly certain of the context. I'd have to review video.
Would that be important to know to make sure that someone after 5 or 6 hours is telling you what actually happened as opposed to something they're making up?
No, sir. There
No?
were other indicators that it was a truthful statement, that any types of mental issues were not an issue, a concern. They did not play a factor.
Is there any physical evidence, such as the blood of little Joe that's been identified, any physical evidence to indicate that Joe CLYDE was in fact killed and where he was killed?
There is blood on his clothing, as well as blood in the center console of his vehicle.
Again, I ask blood of Joe CLYDE Daniels.
Statements of Joseph Daniels, as well as statements of Krystal Daniels.
Do you understand what physical evidence is?
Yes, sir. I'm very familiar with
Are
physical
statements
evidence.
physical evidence?
No, sir.
All right. I'll ask you again. We don't know whose blood was on Joseph Daniels' clothing. So what physical evidence is there that Joe Clyde Daniels was in fact killed and where he was killed?
I've stated that we have blood, sir.
Blood, but it could be Joseph Daniels' blood.
Those tests have not come back.
So any physical evidence that indicates that Joe Clyde Daniels was killed, that you can point to and say that's little Joe's blood, that's little Joe's hair, that's little Joe's clothing, little Joe's teeth.
Sir, in this situation, I would love more than anything to be able to point to the body of Joe Clyde Daniels. And unfortunately,
I'll ask you
I
again.
cannot do that.
Judge, I'm
I'll
going
ask
to
you-
object. It's already been asked and answered.
It has not
The
been
plaintiff
answered.
already testified that we're pending lab results. I think that's clear. We'll know when the lab results are back.
Mr. Lockhart,
Is there hair, teeth, Joe Clyde's clothing, anything that has been identified as belonging to Joe Clyde Daniels to indicate that he was killed and where he was killed?
All of that is going to be upon finding the body of Joe Clyde Daniels, and I have not been able to do that yet, sir.
So, no is your answer. Is that correct? There's no identifiable physical evidence at this point,
We have not found the body of Joe Clyde Daniels.
or any other physical evidence. No hair, no fingernails, no physical evidence other than unidentified blood.
There's no indication that there would be fingernails left at the scene. There's no indication that his hair was pulled out at the scene. There was no indication that his teeth were knocked out at the scene of the crime.
Again, other than unidentified blood, what physical evidence tells you that he was killed and where?
The circumstantial corroborating evidence of the statements tells me that he was killed,
The
sir.
physical evidence. You understand what physical evidence is.
Sir, I've explained to you the physical evidence in this investigation.
What is the physical evidence other than unidentified blood that shows that he was killed? Physical evidence, not statements, physical evidence. What is it?
Unfortunately, it's his body, and we have not found that yet.
So other than his body, there's not any.
No, sir.
All right. How many different crime scenes were processed?
The residence was processed.
What about which vehicles were processed?
The silver Impala, the red Impala.
Any other vehicles?
Vehicles were searched at the scene pertinent to the initial search warrant at 1112 Garners Creek Road.
Was there any luminol testing used inside the house to determine the presence of blood?
I don't know what chemicals were used by the team inside the house.
But to your knowledge, there's nothing to indicate blood was found in the house?
No, sir. That's correct.
Now, logically, if there's blood on Joseph Daniels' clothing, shoes, and on the console of the vehicle, would it not make sense to you if Joe Clyde was beat to the point he was bleeding to leave blood, that there would be blood in the house if that's where it happened?
It depends the amounts. My understanding, based on reviewing the lab reports, are that the presumptive tests, the areas that were indicated for blood, the samples were too small to conduct the hemoglobin testing, which would indicate to me that they're extremely small samples of blood that were even found. So it's very possible that somehow that blood transferred to Joe Daniels, or to Joseph Daniels, excuse me, in transit, that it may not have been enough to leave anything behind at the scene as far as blood.
You think that's factually consistent, that there'd be blood all over the defendant's clothing and the console of the car, but no blood in the living room where he says he beat the child for 5 to 10 minutes?
There's not blood all over his clothing, sir.
As a part of this investigation, did you check to see if there'd been any prior complaints on any of the people in the household before, law enforcement complaints?
Those may have been done during the initial couple days of the endangered child alert. I'm not familiar with any.
Oh.
I understand that the two defendants don't have a criminal history.
Do you know if any books were taken out of the house?
I'm not familiar, no, sir.
Are you aware of any other charges based on the evidence you've obtained that will be brought against either one of these defendants?
I'm not. Of course, that would be a question for the District Attorney General, and I would be consulting his guidance on any of those decisions.
Have y'all discussed any other charges?
You'd have to ask him, sir.
I don't object to any discussion about other charges under attorney-client, not attorney-client, but work product.
We'll sustain that objection. Move on, please, Mr. Walker.
Yes, Your Honor. Do you know if in this neighborhood, if there are any other potential suspects that were originally looked at or initially looked at?
Related to
Like
April
child sex
4th,
offenders in the area, that type of thing?
Yes, sir. On April 4th, it's kind of standard, especially with an endangered child alert, based on the preliminary information we had at the time. I was part of some of the teams that did the checks on sex offenders in the area. We compiled a list of all of them and searched their homes as well as interviewed them.
Did you review the older brother Alex's statement?
Which one, sir?
The child advocacy interview he gave. One, the first interview, and then I think on the 9th he gave another interview.
I've reviewed, I've been told about his initial one, the one that Joseph Daniels drove him to. I was present for events leading up to his second one, but then had to leave that was when I was conducting Krystal Daniels, overseeing the polygraph and her interview.
Are you familiar that he indicated that someone was stabbing Joe CLYDE Daniels in that interview?
I believe I was relayed that there was information about a knife, about blood, but I'd have to review that the video that the Child Advocacy Center did relating to those comments.
And do you recall that he said that that person was not his father, was not Joseph Daniels?
I don't recall that. I remember being told that there were a lot of signs of prior abuse, that layers, as it was described to me, that needed to be delved into, that there was some imagination happening as well in that interview. So,
And are you familiar with whether or not law enforcement ever been called out to this residence previously in regard to Krystal Daniels threatening herself or other people with a knife?
No, sir. I would not be surprised, given the relationship that I know between Krystal and Joseph's family members. My understanding is that it is a tumultuous relationship, and with periods of arguments and domestic situations. So I wouldn't be surprised that law enforcement has been called out there in the past.
That's all the questions I have.
Agent Boyd, Tim Potter, good morning, and I do
sir.
represent Ms. Daniels. So I'm going to focus on Ms. Daniels a little bit
Yes,
in
sir.
my questioning of you. Obviously, you know what a preliminary hearing is. You've
Yes, sir.
probably been through several of those, right?
Yes, sir.
And what we're dealing with today are evidence and fact, not assumptions. You can agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ms. Daniels, you said was interviewed, and that was quite a lengthy interview, right?
Yes, sir.
Probably more than 6 hours in length. Is that true?
From the beginning of the polygraph, the interview was not conducted until after the polygraph, and it may be 3 hours in length, 3-4 hours.
Now, was Ms. Daniels Mirandized as part of that interview process?
She was, yes, sir.
Was that prior to the polygraph?
It was during the inception of the polygraph.
Okay. She wasn't separately Mirandized and advised of her right to remain silent subsequent to the polygraph being conducted?
There was no break in contact. The interview was all one seamless, fluid event. there was no reason to Mirandize him, no, sir. Or, excuse me, Mirandize her, no, sir.
Okay. And during the course of her interview that was seamless, you said after the polygraph was conducted, she made certain statements to you about what happened that night. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
You've alluded to that already.
Yes, sir.
So let's explore that just a little bit. Isn't it true that Ms. Daniels told you that Alex walked into the bedroom and advised them that Baby Joe, I'll refer to him as Baby Joe, had peed on the floor? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you also learned from her interview that Mr. Joe Daniels, the father, went outside of the bedroom, presumably to clean up the mess in the floor. Is that right?
Yes, sir. That was the initial story.
And she stayed in the bedroom.
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the course of your interview, she expressed to you that at some point in time, and I think you talked about it in response to questions from Mr. Miller, she heard what sounded like a cross between a scream and a cry. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Painful scream, she described it.
And then she said it went silent.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And in her testimony, she said that's when she exited the bedroom to check on what was going on. Is that
Yes,
right?
Sir. Yes, sir.
And you've just testified that she expressed that she saw Mr. Daniel standing over the child with his fist balled up. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And I think your testimony was that the child was lying on the floor.
Yes, sir.
And her story to you was she wasn't able to get close to the child.
She didn't say she wasn't able to. She said she did not get close enough.
Okay. And there's a reason for that, right? The reason she gave you.
She did not say why she didn't get close enough. She said that Mr. Daniels, Joseph Daniels, did take a swing at her. He didn't hit her, and told her that if she told anybody that he would kill her. But she stated that she never said she even made an attempt to get to Joe Clyde to even check on him.
Okay, so that's an important fact. So according to Miss Daniels, the father, Joseph Daniels, presumably after he's been beating this child into a state where the child's not even responding, took a swing at her when she came out of the bedroom and threatened her, told her he would kill her if she told anybody, and told her to get back in the bedroom. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes, sir, that's true.
In which case, she told you she went back to the bedroom.
Yes, sir.
And in the course of your investigation, you learned that subsequent to her going back to the bedroom after this threat, she heard the door shut on the house, and also a car door shut. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And then her statement to you, is that she came out of the bedroom and Baby Joe was gone.
Yes.
And she said she opened the door to the house and the red car was gone. Is that true?
Yes, sir, that's true.
She told you that she went back into the bedroom and she thinks she might have fallen asleep. Isn't that what she told you?
I'd have to review it to hear her words exactly, but she stated she fell asleep. Whether she thought she fell asleep or not, I recall she just saying that she went to sleep.
Did you learn from the course of your interview at all that Miss Daniels was on any type of medication or that she had taken any type of sleep aid that night?
I don't recall her stating that. Again, I'd have to review the interview in length.
Ms. Daniels did confirm for you that her cell phone was not there.
Yes, sir.
And you don't have any evidence to offer this court this morning that, in fact, she had possession of her cell phone?
No, sir. As really the only thing, I'm trying to think of what could be potentially to show that she had it, other than the corroborating statements of the two, and no, sir.
Mr. Daniels, in fact, said he took her cell phone.
Yes, sir.
And you're not aware of any text messages or communications with Mr. Daniels after he had left the house with her phone?
No, sir, I'm not aware of any.
Do you have any evidence to offer the court that Ms. Daniels knew or should have known prior to this night that Joe Daniels was a danger to these children?
Not to the children, no, sir.
Okay. You do have some information, however, that he had allegedly been abusive to her, right?
I've heard information on both sides that they both got into some heated discussions and strong arguments. I've heard stories about Joseph when he would get angry, he would strike the wall, putting holes in the wall. But I've also been told that was so that he would not hit her, being Krystal. So I've, to fully answer your question, sir, I've heard some.
She
both
told
sides.
you that Joe Daniels has body slammed her before. Isn't that right?
She stated that he's never hit her before. I remember asking her that. I don't
Remember the
recall,
words body
I
slam
don't
in the
recall
interview?
body slam, no, sir. But
And of course, if
I'm
that's
not,
on the interview, it would be
I'd
there.
have to review it, yes, sir.
Okay. How much do you think Mr. Joe Daniel weighs, the father?
230.
Do you know that he has some type of martial arts training?
Yes, sir.
What did you learn?
I've been informed that he has a black belt in martial arts.
A black belt in Taekwondo?
I'm not certain the exact style, but I'm aware of just martial arts in general.
Other than saying, and I think I don't want to put words in your mouth,
Yes,
but
sir.
I think in response to questioning from General Miller, you made the statement that Mr. Daniel said Alex and Krystal were present.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that's about as detailed as it got from Mr. Daniels, right? About how present they were.
Yes, sir. I was relating to what did Alex see, what did Krystal see, and I received acknowledgement that they were there and observed it.
That they were present.
Yes,
And
sir.
that they observed something.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Which is consistent with what she said. She told you that she came out of the room, saw Joe Daniels standing over the child with his fist balled up, and the child is not making any noise and is laying on the floor. Is that right?
Yes, sir. That's what she said.
So that would make her present. Is that
Yes,
right?
sir. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any evidence to offer this court that at the time Miss Daniels saw that this child was not already dead?
No, sir.
Do you have any evidence to offer the court that Krystal Daniels assisted in any way with the disposal of this child's body?
The physical act of the disposal, no, sir, I don't. Other than the cover-up afterwards of the 1 a.m. Check and the continuing story of just he walked out of the house.
Which may or may not be grounds for another cause of action on a different day, but we know that our client is charged with aggravated child neglect or endangerment. That's the only charge right now against Ms. Daniels. You understand that?
Yes, sir, I do understand.
So the fact that she would have lied allegedly to police officers after the fact isn't one of the elements of this offense. It might be something else.
Well, I believe there's an aspect of that to the perpetuation, allowing the act to occur, having not doing anything to stop it or do anything. Say hypothetically, Joe CLYDE was lying there motionless and was not necessarily dead at the time initially, but died moments later. There was no act conducted on her part to provide any aid to try and do anything to prevent his death.
And that essentially is the gravamen of the state's case against my client. I'm trying to narrow in on what is the state's case against Krystal Daniel. Okay? The state doesn't have any proof, does it, that Ms. Daniel actually caused the abuse to this child?
No, sir, not that she was not directly in cause of that abuse.
Thank you. And so, again, essentially what the state's argument is, if I'm understanding, what the TBI's theory after 2 months of investigation almost, is that Ms. Daniel, seeing this child supine on the floor and not calling someone or not getting help, that's what she did wrong.
That's an element of it, yes, sir. Obviously the continuing perpetuation of the lies, the cover-up, that would be her
Now, wait a minute. Lying to the police, though,
responsibility.
when the police come to the house and say what happened, and when my client says he ran off, presumably that might be some other type of case we're not here about, right? False report or accessory after the fact. But the only thing we're here about today is aggravated child abuse or aggravated child neglect. So lying to the police after you came to the house wouldn't be an element of what she's charged with today, would it, sir?
It would, because those lies are about the abuse that led to Joe CLYDE's death.
Okay. We'll let the court take judicial notice of what that means. But she gave you a reason, did she not? Let's talk about that while
Sure.
we're on that topic.
Certainly.
She gave you a reason for the alleged lie to police officers when they came to the house, didn't she?
Yes.
The reason that she gave was that she was afraid of Mr. Daniel and also her father-in-law. Is that true?
That's true.
In fact, I think that the answer she gave you in your thorough interview of her was when officers came and you asked her, why didn't you just tell the officer at that point that he didn't just run off, her response was, he was standing there. Is that right?
I believe, I'd have to review the exact words, but I believe it was related to the fact that she was scared of Joseph.
And she told you more than once in her response that, in her responses to your questions, that you needed to please protect her from her father-in-law and please don't let him find out if she said anything bad against Mr. Daniel.
She did, yes, sir.
In fact, you assured her, we're the police
Yes,
and
sir.
we'll protect you in your interview, right?
Yes, sir.
You congratulated her in your interview for telling you the truth. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
Tell me who the adult female was that was living in the house other than Miss Daniels.
Joseph Daniels and Aunt Joyce, as well as Belle Daniels and Joe Daniels, Joseph's father.
Now, the mother and father-in-law presumably were not at home on the night of this alleged incident. Is that right?
That's correct. That's been confirmed by records.
But the aunt was.
Yes.
And her name is what?
Aunt Joyce, Joyce E. They refer.
Do we have a full name for her?
I don't remember her last name, sir.
Joyce, her first name?
Yes, sir.
Has Miss Joyce said anything to you or given the TBI any information that would incriminate Krystal Daniels?
She stated that the night before they were arguing about Krystal's infidelity. She's also provided information of past acts of Krystal relating to, I believe it was Aunt Joyce that mentioned there was a dog that she could not have, and that Krystal, in revenge, Krystal had a dog that was not welcome at the house, and Aunt Joyce did have a dog. I believe it was Aunt Joyce that said this, that in revenge for Krystal not being able to have her dog, Krystal took that other dog by the hind legs and slammed it up against a wall, killing it.
Give you a time frame on that, sir?
No, sir, not off the top of my head.
All right, so despite this bias that she might have against Miss Daniel for allegedly killing her dog, did she incriminate her in any way regarding the disappearance of baby Joe?
Aunt Joyce has a hearing disability, was present at the time of the event at the house, however was sleeping. I've spoken to her and observed and witnessed her hearing disability, and it's sufficient enough that I believe she would not have heard anything.
So is the answer no? I'll repeat my question. Despite her bias against Miss Daniel for allegedly injuring her dog, did Miss Joyce, Aunt Joyce, incriminate my client in any way regarding the disappearance or injuries to baby Joe?
She did not witness it.
So no?
So no. She had provided other incriminating information, such as history and the arguments the night before, but not a direct witness testimony of the death of Joe CLYDE.
Has Mr. Daniels in any way incriminated Krystal Daniels in this incident?
Again, the direct action that resulted in the death of Joe CLYDE, a physical act, a striking, no.
But he said she and Alex were there.
Yes, sir.
And again, I go back to this because it's fairly important given the elements of the charge. Mr. Daniels didn't elaborate about what there means or when she was there. Is that right?
That's correct.
The witnesses you've mentioned today that we've heard of for the first time, Mr. McCormick and Ms. Jones, who were on the road that night, did either one of those individuals say anything that would be incriminating about Krystal Daniels? Did they witness her? Did they see her?
They did not.
But Mr. McCormick, did he give the TBI information that he in fact saw baby Joe that night?
Yes, sir.
And did Ms. Jones give information that she in fact saw Joe Daniels that night?
Yes, sir.
Neither one of them saw Krystal Daniels.
That's correct.
Is it the state's theory that Mr. Daniels beat this child inside the home only, or would the child, is there also evidence to suggest that the child was beaten outside of the home?
I can't rule that out. However, his statement and her statement were all from the inside of the residence.
Didn't Mr. Daniels give a statement that when he saw the pee on the floor, he spanked the child, was the language he used, and then also put him outside?
Yes, sir.
And then went outside and hit him some more outside?
During the course of that interview, it began with the initial statement, the initial story of waking up and just finding him gone. And I think I may have alluded to this earlier. It's like an onion. You start stripping away layers and you get more and more closer to the truth. So there, in between that initial statement and the final confession, there are layers moving, gravitating towards that truth. And so there are statements of, first he says, well, okay, I did spank him, but it was just light. Then that evolved further into I struck him very hard and I was cussing at him and I didn't even clean up the pee. Then that developed and led into what we resulted in being even closer to the truth of admissions that he in fact beat him with closed fists.
And in fact, some of the statements about beating him with a closed fist, he said he went outside,
Yes, sir.
beat the child outside some more, and brought him back into the house. Is that
Yes,
right?
sir. Yes, sir.
And presumably at that time, Ms. Daniels would have been in her room.
According to her, yes, sir.
So does the state have any evidence to suggest that Ms. Daniels, other than calling someone after seeing this child on the floor, not making a sound, could have done something to prevent the harm to her child?
No evidence per se. I think there's a common sense approach to it that you have to take, in the sense that anyone reasonable watching, coming out and seeing that, I would think a reasonable person, you would have to fight them back to get to their child. There's no indication that that happened at all. According even a self-serving statement from Ms. Daniels, she never even mentioned that.
Anyone other than potentially a battered woman, right? Someone who's fearful for their own safety and the safety of their other two children in the house.
At that time, she was not living. She was not living with Mr. Daniels. He was in custody. He wasn't able to get to her.
No, I think you're talking about a different time frame.
No, sir.
I'm
No,
talking
sir.
about the night when she allegedly came out of her room and was threatened and went back into her room and he swung at her. She went back into her room because she was told that she would be killed.
I say yes, sir. She made mention that he had said those things to her. I'm not exactly certain the time frame of when it happened, how much time elapsed between when she came out of the room and when he said that to her. They mention other conversations between them.
But you don't have any proof to the contrary, do you?
No, sir. She did not say anything to the contrary.
How long had the Daniels lived at this particular residence?
I'm not certain of the exact time frame. I believe at more than a year.
Okay, and they have, other than baby Joe, there are 2 other children, is that
Yes,
right?
sir,
And
there
what
are.
are their ages?
8 and 3, I believe.
Okay, so baby Joe is the middle child.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and both, and certainly the 8-year-old and baby Joe were enrolled as students in Dixon County schools, is that right?
I believe they were. Yes, sir. I would assume it would be Dixon County Schools.
All right. That's all I have, Agent Boyd. Thank you for your time.
Yes, sir.
Any redirect from the state?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Agent Boyd, you can step down. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Is that the state's proof?
State's proof, Your Honor.
State rests. Mr. Lockhart, any proof?
No proof, Your Honor.
Mr. Potter, any proof?
No proof, Your Honor.
All right. Care to be heard, General?
Your Honor, you heard proof, I'll waive.
Mr. Lockhart?
Waive, Your Honor.
Mr. Potter?
I would like to make an argument.
Okay.
Respectfully, Your Honor, this case has gotten a lot of publicity, and I know that these cases are very, very tough. We have a child that's unaccounted for, so it makes the decisions very hard. Ms. Daniels, our client, has one charge. One charge for consideration today. And that charge is aggravated child neglect or endangerment. Based on the evidence that we've heard from today from the state, it seems apparent that the state's traveling under TCA 3915-401C, which states that a parent or custodian of a child 8 years of age or less commits child endangerment who knowingly exposes such child to or knowingly fails to protect such child from abuse or neglect resulting in physical injury or imminent danger to the child. Thus, some of my questioning of Agent Boyd. This is 2 parts. The first part is knowingly exposes the child. So please recall my question of Agent Boyd, what evidence does the state have that Mr. Daniels had a propensity to harm this child? What evidence does a mother have that it's a danger to the child to even let the child be alone with a father? Sometimes that's true. Sometimes that's true. If you have a dangerous father and a mother lets a child go with that father, if the father has threatened the child or if the father has harmed the child before, there is no evidence of that in the record. There's no evidence to suggest that allowing Mr. Daniels to be alone with this child would have been knowingly exposing the child to danger. She's in bed, the father gets up to spend time with the child, to clean up a mess, presumably, or to just be alone with him. That's not knowingly putting the child in danger. So we look at the next part. Knowingly fails to protect the child from abuse or neglect. Presumably, it is the state's theory that Miss Daniels, because she was in the home and because she got up after hearing her child cry out and came out of the room, presumably, she failed to protect the child then by not intervening or calling someone in some way. That's the state's case against my client. But what we've not heard is any proof that the child was beaten subsequent to her coming out of the room. The beating had taken place. The beating had taken place inside the home. The beating had taken place outside of the home. The beating had already occurred. In fact, so much so that this child's crying had stopped and the child was not making a noise. So the state can't offer any proof to Your Honor that Ms. Daniels' actions did anything that might have protected this child. Obviously, a lot of what Agent Boyd's talked about today might be an argument for another day about whether or not my client was an accessory after the fact to a crime, which is a totally different charge with different elements. We can argue about that one day. A lot about what the state presented today arguably might be on another day whether or not she made false statements to police. Those are different charges with different elements, and we're not having a preliminary hearing on that today. All we're having a preliminary hearing about today is whether or not she knowingly exposed the child to danger or knowingly failed to protect a child. The state's offered no evidence that she was engaged in the disposal of the body. The state's offered no evidence that she actually harmed the child herself. The state's only evidence is that she came out of her room and got told by this man, who is the state's alleged perpetrator of murder, that he would kill her if she said a word, and to get back in her room after he swung at her. I'm respectfully asking the court to dismiss this case today. I understand what probable cause is. We've had thousands of preliminary hearings in our career, but this case should be dismissed this morning against this woman because the state can't meet its threshold. Locking her up and charging her with an A felony because there's a lot of uncertainty swirling around and because we don't know where a body is, I get it. I understand it. I understand the tactic. But it's now court day. We're here for a prelim. And I'm respectfully asking the court to dismiss this case against this lady because there is not enough probable cause to suggest that she violated the very elements of this charge. They're laid out black and white. To the extent that the court denies my motion and allows this case to proceed, I have filed a separate motion regarding bond and would like to be heard about that after Your Honor here's what the state has to say.
We'll do that, Mr. Potter. Thank you. General?
Judge, what we do have in this case, and what Mr. Potter didn't mention in his closing, is a mother of a 5-year-old that when she heard his screaming and crying, got out of bed, walked into the living room, regardless of what Mr. Daniels said, her action was one thing: to return to bed. She went back to bed. That is the crime in this case. She failed to do anything to protect her 5-year-old son. She went back to bed. That's why she's charged under this code section. Based on the proof you've heard today, the defendant, Mr. Daniels, left the home for some period of time, 2 to 3 hours. She could have done many things in that 2 to 3 hours to help baby Joe and to protect the other children. If somebody had just gone on a rampage to kill a 5-year-old, what action did she take to protect any of them? She went back to bed and then wakes up the next morning and perpetrates this lie that her child was supposed to get on the bus and didn't go to school, that's a runaway. She walked hand in hand with Mr. Daniels in perpetrating this lie and perpetuating the lie. This court is being expected to believe that a mother of a 5-year-old would see a motionless, still child on the floor and just go back to bed? No, she failed to protect her son. That's what she did. She neglected him. She allowed this to continue on. And there is no other proof that suggests otherwise.
First of all, as to Mr. Joseph Ray Daniels, having heard the state's proof, the court finds the state has met its burden of probable cause. Therefore, Mr. Daniels, this charge against you will be bound over to the next term of the Dixon County Grand Jury. As to Mrs. Daniels, the court, having heard the testimony today from Agent Boyd, and first of all, looking at the statute, 3915-402, the parent of a child 8 years of age or less, which in this case, Joseph CLYDE Daniels, age 5, commits child endangerment who knowingly fails to protect such child from abuse or neglect resulting in physical injury or imminent danger to the child. Respectfully, Mr. Potter, I would say that your client was on notice that her husband, Mr. Daniels, posed a threat to the child when she came out of bed to investigate a child's painful scream, saw him standing over her child motionless on the floor with his fist clenched. And I will give credence to the state's position that at that point we've got the testimony being that her statement was that Mr. Daniels, her husband, threatened her and told her to go back to bed. Then she told Agent Boyd that he left the house. She came back out and her husband and her child were gone. Mr. Daniels, he had a phone there at the house. We know that based on his statement. She could have called 911 at that point. If I'm guessing, I would say that based on General Crouch's argument that the state would have considered any actions that Ms. Daniels may have taken to mitigate the circumstances surrounding the death of her son that morning, but instead, as General Crouch said, she went back to bed and went to sleep. Therefore, the court finds the state as to Mrs. Daniels has met its burden of proof. Her case will be bound over to the next term of the Dixon County Grand Jury. Before I sign off on these bindovers, Mr. Lockhart, do you have anything to say about bond, sir? You wish to be heard in that regard?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Potter, go ahead then, sir.
Thank you, Judge. Respectfully, I did file a motion to reduce her bail, and as I said in my motion, Ms. Daniels has a $1 million bond that's been set. Our Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals has said that fixing a bond, it's unconstitutional to fix a bond to assure that a defendant will not gain her freedom. Setting a $1 million bond for this defendant is tantamount to telling her you cannot get out of jail. This court has already adjudicated her to be indigent by appointing her counsel. We've gone through that factor process and determined that she's simply not able to hire her own lawyer, much less, I would submit, Your Honor, make a $1 million bond. Her bond should be reduced. It's unconscionable. It's unconstitutional. You take a look at the factors for bond. We know from listening to Agent Boyd today, he testified about several of those factors. TCA 11115, she has no criminal history, which I would submit to Your Honor would mean that she's never failed to appear in court when required to do so because she's not been charged with anything. She has family in this community, including 2 other children that we know where they are, who attend, one of which attends Dixon County schools. She's lived here for a period of time. She has a residence in this county. And so I would respectfully submit to Your Honor that the bond should be reduced. I have suggested a bond of $50,000 because statutorily that would be the bond that a magistrate or judicial commissioner would set in a case with these charges absent some proof of a flight risk, and we don't have any proof of a flight risk for Ms. Daniels. There just isn't any. We can make assumptions and presumptions, but she's just not a flight risk. We'll submit to any conditions that Your Honor wants to give her, including GPS tracking, including reporting regularly. I'll practically say, Your Honor, I'm not sure that she can make even the bond I'm suggesting. I don't think she can. If she can, I'll be surprised. But it's certainly an appropriate bond. I think to the extent that the state wishes to argue, she just doesn't need to get out of jail because there's a whole lot we don't know, and we don't know where this child's alleged body is. Those are not factors. That means we're just locking her up and keeping her there because we don't want her out. She's not been charged with a capital offense. She has not been. She's not charged with homicide, and after today, I would submit it will be real surprised if she ever gets charged with homicide based on those statements from Agent Boyd. So absent a capital offense, she has to be given a reasonable bond, not just a bond, but a reasonable bond. And I would submit to Your Honor that a reasonable bond is one that she can make that would simply assure her appearance in court.
Thank you, Mr.
Your Honor, I'd
Potter.
like to put on some proof on that.
Certainly.
We've got factors, not just argument. I'm going to call Agent Boyd again.
Agent Boyd?
Agent Boyd, you've testified to a couple of things that are relevant to bond factors. Specifically, what did you say when I asked who owned the house that they were living in?
Joseph's father?
Is that the same Joseph's father that she's terrified of?
Yes, sir.
That's going to kill her if she says something against Joseph?
That's what she
So
stated.
she doesn't have a home in the community as far as you know, does she?
No, sir.
Now, I believe you testified when I asked you if you ascertained her employment status that it was unemployed.
Yes, sir.
Have you had the opportunity in the course of your investigation to make any determination whether she had some plans at or about the time this child was killed to leave the state of Tennessee?
Yes, sir.
And what is that?
There is Facebook communication between her and a male who lives in Kansas City, where she states that she wants to move to Kansas. Not only that male, but also her mother lives in Kansas, and she was making plans up until the dates of March 28th, which is only approximately 5-6 days prior to the murder of Joe Clyde, to leave and move to Kansas.
And you testified that you thought they had lived in the house that neither of them own, that's owned by someone that she's deathly afraid of for approximately a year.
Yes, sir. I'm not exactly certain the time frame that they started living there.
Has anyone come to you and vouched for her credibility or reliability?
No, sir.
In fact, have you seen anything at all in the course of your investigation to lead you to believe that she's a person who has any credibility or reliability?
No, sir. I've heard just the opposite.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Mr. Potter?
Agent Boyd, Judge, can I question you here?
Yes, sir.
Agent Boyd, so let me get this straight. Her mother lives in Kansas, is that right?
Yes, sir. I believe Wichita.
Okay, so she has family in Kansas, right?
Yes, sir.
Not Paraguay, but Kansas, correct? Another state.
Mm-hmm.
True? Not out of the country. Don't have any connection to her that ties out of the United States of America, right?
I'm not aware of any.
Right. And we've been given a voluminous package, I presume, of Facebook exchanges. We'll read that in time, but was she talking to her children about visiting her mother in Kansas?
I don't know if she was talking to her children. She was referencing the fact that her relationship with Joseph was towards the end. She had torn up the marriage license in retrospect, given the gravity of what happened.
Might have been the best thing she could do.
Joking, yes.
Judge, if I could just be heard on that.
Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Judge, the factors speak to what is a reasonable bond, not no bond. With all due respect, I can't recall in my years of experience in this court someone charged with aggravated child neglect or endangerment given a bond anywhere close to what the bond is on my client. Especially someone who's been charged with, who's been found to be indigent. It's just wrong. It's just wrong for the state to argue that this bond is appropriate, because it's not, and we all know that. And I'm respectfully asking that it be set at a level where a reasonable person could meet it. And Your Honor gives conditions all the time for bond. We have conditions, and the conditions might be you don't leave the state, you have a GPS tracking device, or you know, in alcohol-related cases, you wear a scram detector. We have those types of restrictions all the time, so it's not unusual, and we'll submit to those restrictions. In this case, as Your Honor knows, could take months, and it's appropriate that she be given a bond that a reasonable person can meet, not an excessive. $50,000 is the statutorily suggested amount, unless the state can prove a flight risk. And there is no flight risk proven, other than she's talking about maybe going to Kansas to see her mother, where her mother lives. And we'll agree that she can't go to Kansas to see her mother. If she did, there are police in Kansas.
Your Honor, if I may, 4011-115 lists 8 factors, and the affordability of bond is not one of them. Now, we take each of the 8 factors and consider what we've heard here today. The only proof of length of residence in the community is that they've lived in a house she doesn't own for maybe a year. In fact, the owner of that house, she is terrified of. So, factor number 1 is out. Factor number 2, the defendant's employment status, history, and financial condition. Mr. Potter says she's indigent. You found her indigent, and she's unemployed. So number 2 doesn't help her. Number 3, family ties and relationships. She's terrified of her husband, who is in jail, and she's terrified of the people with whom she was living, and presumably would go back to that house. The only thing that does help her, she doesn't have a criminal history. Jumping back to 4, her reputation, character, and mental condition. I can't speak to her mental condition, but I can tell you her character is abysmal. She assisted in the authoring and propagation of a lie for several days that maybe would have resulted in the finding of this child had she not have done that. No one has come forward and vouched for her at all. The nature of the offense and the probability of conviction, notwithstanding any of Mr. Potter's arguments, I submit to a court that a confession is pretty strong evidence. So the probability of conviction on a Class A felony where she's going to prison is pretty high, and that's incentive to run. There was proof from Agent Boyd she's not going to Kansas to see her mom. That's one of the reasons to have some kind of illicit and nefarious affair with someone she's met over the internet. The bond as set is appropriate and should remain there. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, this is General Sessions Court. So respectfully, Mr. Potter, at this time, I'm going to deny your motion to reduce the bond. The bond will remain set based on the factors as enumerated, in Tennessee Code Annotated Section 4011-118. Once this case comes out of the grand jury, certainly you can renew your motion for bond reduction in circuit court, but at this time, I find that the bond as presently set is appropriate based on the facts and circumstances.
Judge, I think respectfully the law allows me to appeal the issue of bond now before the grand jury returns an indictment or a no-true bill, and I would respectfully request the right to do that to circuit court.
You can certainly do that, Mr. Potter.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Hearing none, court's adjourned.